The historical development of black music throughout the Americas represents more than entertainment because it contains a narrative of survival, identity, and resistance. Black communities throughout the Americas fought against racial discrimination and cultural oppression since European settlers started their colonization and initiated the Atlantic slave trade route. Our education materials, classroom discussions, and documentaries revealed the deep historical origins of these conflicts which continue to affect society in present times. Various African musical traditions spread across the Americas to create multiple distinct musical styles because there was no one African musical genre that spanned all regions. The African diaspora population established themselves in various locations which led to the creation of new cultural mixes. The musical identities developed through the combination of African traditions with European and indigenous elements which occurred at various points throughout history. The musical traditions of Afro-descendant communities throughout the Americas took different forms because of their unique historical backgrounds and geographical settings and cultural traditions. Brazil serves as an ideal research subject to demonstrate musical traditions and historical development. The Brazilian slave trade during 1540 to 1860 brought 5.5 million enslaved Africans to the country. The African communities maintained their cultural heritage, spiritual beliefs, and narrative traditions throughout the experience of suffering through slavery. Through cultural expression, African communities fought against their forced labor in their attempts to lose their cultural heritage. Afro-Brazilian music traditions, including Samba and Capoeira, continue to showcase the cultural heritage of African descent in Brazil. The Afro-descendant communities maintained their cultural heritage through the practice of music, their preparation of traditional food, their use of native language, and their spiritual traditions. This video explores how Samba and Capoeira evolved into resistance movements against cultural oppression while linking these traditions to our course materials.
The origins of African rhythm and oral tradition can be traced back to ancient African cultures. Rhythm, drumming, and storytelling have always been central parts of African life. When the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to Brazil, the Portuguese imposed severe restriction on their lives, limiting their education, political participation, and cultural expression. African communities used music as their tool to survive under colonial rule. Through music, people managed to safeguard their historical accounts together with their religious faith and cultural heritage. The Smithsonian explains that musical traditions enabled people to protect their cultural heritage throughout the brutal period of slavery. Samba and Capoeira evolved into two influential cultural forms, which originated from the African struggle against oppression. The musical style of Samba originated from African musical elements, which merged with local Brazilian traditions, while its name Samba possibly stems from the Angolan word Simba, which describes the ritual practice of singing and dancing to call upon divine powers. Enslaved Africans created capoeira as an Afro-Brazilian material art, which presented itself as a dance to conceal their defensive training. The musical and dance practices of enslaved Africans served as a way to learn self-defense technique while they concealed their resistance activities. The practice of capoeira unites musical elements with acrobatic movements and spiritual practices, although it faced criminalization until 1937, when people continued to practice it through their communities. The cultural heritage of Brazil exists through Samba and Capoeira because these traditions combine African elements with indigenous and Portuguese influences. Through Samba and Capoeira, Afro-Brazilian people continue to express their cultural heritage and fight against oppression.
Samba and Capoeira served as a secret form of resistance which Afro-Brazilians used to fight against Portuguese colonial rule oppression. Music functioned as a shared language which allowed enslaved people to express their freedom within their communities. Through spiritual events and rhythmic dances, Afro-Brazilians managed to preserve their cultural heritage and maintain their traditional values despite facing strict colonial restrictions. Sergio Gallegos explains in his research about Afro-Mexicans that musical expressions linked to African roots faced suppression because society considered them inferior and dangerous. The enforcement of racist beliefs about black culture led to the suppression of African musical traditions in both Brazil and Mexico. The survival of Samba and Capoeira as cultural resistance movements enabled Afro-Brazilians to preserve their identity while fighting against cultural elimination attempts.
Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, developed coloniality of power theory, which demonstrates that colonialism maintained its power structure after Latin American countries gained independence. The racial systems and cultural control mechanisms established during colonial times sustained European cultural dominance. According to his analysis, Afro-Brazilian cultural expressions such as Samba and Capoeira faced suppression because they threatened the dominant belief that European culture surpassed all others. The continued existence of these traditions demonstrate how African descent communities maintain their cultural heritage throughout centuries of forced cultural assimilation. The Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and philosopher Frantz Fanon brought an essential knowledge to the discussion. According to Fanon, colonized people achieved human reconstruction through their cultural activities. Afro-Brazilians, for example, used their musical expressions, spiritual practices, and community activities to rebuild their dignity and emotional power against a system which sought to eliminate their cultural heritage. The musical traditions of Afro-Brazilians demonstrate Fanon's concepts because they transform historical pain into artistic expression, which builds their self-value. Enric Dussel, an Argentinian philosopher, expanded these ideas into a more detailed framework. Dussel supports a complete decolonization process, which demands the establishment of new identities based on marginalized voices instead of colonial authority. The Afro-Brazilian community in Brazil continues their cultural heritage through dance schools and capoeira groups and cultural organizations, which fight against the disappearance of their history.
Resistance can take many forms for many different cultures. Latin America has deep tragic roots of true systematic racism. Afro-Brazilian music has a long history as a form of epistemic resistance, bringing together the first generations of slaves brought over as a method of continuing their cultural practices and spirituality, and has become a melded culture in and of itself, still acting as a way to keep these African roots alive. Samba and capoeira are evidence that art and struggle are interwoven. Afro-Brazilian music shows how rhythm, movement, and self-expression can fight against colonial domination, and give these people a sense of self or humanity in a system meant to suppress this. Under immense trauma such as slavery, oppression, and other epistemic injustices, music provides an emotional, spiritual, and communal space for the empowerment of Afro-Brazilian people across Brazil and the world.
Chora, todo mundo sofre, mas logo se reza pra São Benedito, pra Nossa Senhora e pra Santo Onofre. Mas tem alguém cantando, todo mundo canta, todo mundo dança, todo mundo samba e ninguém se cansa, pois